Good evening. Welcome to the Town of Los Gatos Joint Town Council Parking Authority meeting of March 3rd, 2014. At this time, I'd like to invite those members of the audience to silence your communication devices. And clerk, will you please call the roll?
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Diane McNutt.
Here.
Councilmember Barbara Spector.
Here.
Councilmember Joe Przinski.
Here.
Vice Mayor Marcia Jensen.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Steve Leonardis.
Here. Leading us in the pledge tonight is Laura Herron. Laura, will you please come on up? And we'll share a few words about Laura. Laura is a 7th grader at Fisher Middle School. Laura loves school and all subjects, but her favorites are math and history. Laura will represent history or represent Fisher in a math competition at West Valley College later this month. Laura sings in the Fisher Choir and will be performing at the Women's Basketball Regional Finals in Stanford next month. Laura helps at Van Meter, the elementary school where she attended. Laura has assisted at Monday Morning Helpers and events, including the school play and the pumpkin patch. During last summer, Laura helped at a church camp. Laura is a swimmer and is on the Los Gatos Swim and Racket Club's Stingrays swim team. Laura also does Irish dancing with the Whelan Kennelly School of Irish Dance. Laura used to play soccer on my soccer team for about 5 or 6 seasons, as I recall. Laura enjoys many outdoor activities, including biking, hiking, skiing, sailing, and camping. Laura's parents are from Ireland, where Laura loves to visit. And Laura's parents recently became U.S. citizens within the last year. So I thought it'd be a great honor to have you witness your daughter lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance this evening. So without further ado, let's have a round of applause for Laura Herron.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let's have another round of applause for Miss Laura Herron. Mr. Schultz, could you tell us about our closed session this evening?
Yes, good evening. Council met in closed session to discuss pending litigation. No action was taken that requires reporting under the Brown Act.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to request from the audience, if you wish to speak on any item which is not on the agenda or on the agenda, please fill out one of the speaker cards located in the seats in front of you. And moving on to council matters, does any member of council have any reports? Seeing none, manager matters?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of council, 2 items. First, the town is recruiting resident volunteers to serve on the Arts and Culture Commission, the Transportation and Parking Commission, and the new short-term Housing Element Advisory Board. Applications are due by this Friday, March 7th at 12 noon in the Clerk Administrator's office, and we encourage all residents who are interested in those topics to apply. I also wanted to inform the council that we have had 1 or 2 commissioners who have interest in serving, who are on other commissions that might apply to join the Housing Element Advisory Board given its short-term nature. And that's a judgment the council will have to make when those applications come forward. Also, on March 14th, Friday, March 14th, the town will be hosting a delegation from our sister city of Listowel, Ireland. So Jimmy Dinahan, the Irish Minister of Arts and Culture, will be leading the delegation, and here on the afternoon of Friday, March 14th, and again joining the council on Monday the 17th for St. Patrick's Day. In between, he's serving as the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade up in San Francisco. With that, I'd like to call Henry Bankhead, our co-library manager, to present some exciting statistics on the first 2 years of the library.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. Did you know that our new library has won not one, but 2 American Institute of Architects Awards, one from the California chapter for sustainability and one from the East Bay chapter for design. In addition, over the past 2 years, we've increased elevated levels of usage, and these have stabilized at the elevated level. Checkouts are up by over 61% over the past 2 years, with more than 650,000 items checked out in each of the past 2 years. We have more than a 50% increase in library visits over the same past 2 years since the library opened, with over 350,000 people visiting the library in each of the past 2 years. And we continue to attract new users, almost triple in the first year after the new library opened and almost double in the second year compared to before the new library opened. Currently, we have 34,000 total borrowers. The new library is an unparalleled success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bankhead. Next on our agenda is our consent calendar. Does any member of council wish to pull a consent item? Seeing none, does any member of the audience wish to pull a consent item? Seeing none, then I'll look to council for a motion. Vice Mayor.
I'll move approval of the consent calendar, which now consists of items 1 through 3.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. Passes unanimously. Moving on to verbal communications. At this time, again, if you'd like to speak on any item which is not on the agenda, please fill out one of the speaker cards located in the chairs in front of you. The first speaker this evening is Bob Garzi.
Good evening. I've been a resident of Monte Sereno and Los Gatos for 38 years. I really believe I have a lot to offer this town, and I've also represented the Department of Energy in the green transportation area for 7 years. I am the team leader for Silicon Valley Clean Cities, for Breathe California, and for the Electronic Transportation Development Center. I'm fortunate to be head of transportation in a major part of America, which is Silicon Valley. We have so many tools to use to make a difference that I believe that we can make a difference. And we have been elected and received an award for Silicon Valley being the center and the most receptive region in America for green transportation. I'm looking for a city that's interested in being the leader in Silicon Valley. And I've met with some of you to talk about what those things could be. I propose that as the team leader for what we call the Green Team, that I volunteer to bring 7 green transportation projects to your city. And I will work, as I do now lead, with Silicon Valley Clean Cities and Breathe California as a volunteer to help the city get those things in place. I want to make Los Gatos the center of America for green transportation, and I have the ability to do so if the city would like to work with us. This will bring many grants to the city because green transportation is a very important role in America, and there are many solutions, many of which have come out of this particular region. I would just want to mention a couple of electric repower school bus. That was a grant that we just got, over 17 projects that the Health Trust went out and looked at because they felt it would change the school bus industry. No more parents having to drive their kids to school. No more school buses being retrenched because of cost. more of the focus on school buses that are affordable to run and are low emissions for our children. Just to mention a couple others, electric vehicle financing, EV training center, and solar fueling vehicle center. We have charts that you've looked at that tell this whole story, and if I get invited back, I can present in more detail as to what the Department of Energy can do with Los Gatos. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Rob Houston.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Town Council. I'm Rob Houston. I've been a resident of Los Gatos for 38 years as well. I'm here to, first of all, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Town Manager Greg, for responding to my email regarding Highway 85. Also, I would like to thank you, Mr. Brzezinski, for showing up at the Saratoga VTA meeting. I live close by to the freeway, and I know it's a little bit early, and you're not going to have this on your agenda until April or May, but I would just want to come out now and say that I do oppose of the expansion of Highway 85 for several reasons, first of which, in the performance agreement that was signed by the town prior to construction of 85, it designated to leave the center median open for light rail. And by putting an additional lane in, we're going to lose that capability. And I think having additional lanes is kind of a short-sighted solution to our mass transit issues. I'd like to see it reserved for rail. Also, there will be additional pollution and additional noise. There's so many things that are wrong with this that it just screams of problems. So I urge you that when the time comes that this is on the agenda, that you seriously take a look at the performance agreement that was signed in good faith and try to make sure that they honor that. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mark Weisler.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. Thank you for letting me speak to you. I'm addressing Route 85 also. I'm very concerned about it as it is currently shaping up as a project or a plan. I'm concerned about the pollution, the noise, particulate matter, all of that kind of thing, and hope that it can be reconsidered. I would like for you to try to make the projects and the various authorities live up to the agreements that you already have in place. And also, I would like to see a full environmental impact report, not just the assessment that has currently been proposed for it. Last point, I want to commend you for having a very rigorous agreement on this topic from the past. I guess that was prior council and prior staff, but it's very rigorous, and that's a real good thing to do when you have a very serious undertaking like a freeway that can be around for 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Barry Chang.
Honorable Mayor and the council member, my name is Barry Chen. As many of you know, I'm also a city council member of Cupertino, but I'm here to representing myself, not the entire council. And also, I'm a candidate for State Assembly District 28, which covers this area, because my district, the whole Highway 85, half of it is within my district. Okay, so that's why a lot of concern, a lot of issue. Your former city council member, your former mayor, did a very good job negotiating this Route 85 performance agreement signed on October 23rd, 1990 by your mayor. Okay. As you can see, Town of Los Gatos mayor signed it October 23rd, right? In this agreement, on the page 2, item number 4, is clearly spelled out that the 85 through the town will be a 6-lane facility. So if they add 2 more lanes, 4 lanes, that will make it 8 lanes. That's a clear breach of the contract. On item number 4. Okay. And item number 15. You can see item number 15C1, it says 6 lane again, and then 2 lane reserved for the carpool. And then item number 2 and 3 say 48 feet and 46 foot center median will be reserved for mass transportation, okay? And then item number C4 specifically say extension of Basana existing light rail 9 will go into the center median of Highway 85. So if you allow VTA do what they want to do on express lane to take out the center median and put the 2 toll lane in there, the light rail will never happen will be not never happen, will be really hard to happen to install. And I asked VTA to give us a presentation on January 21st at the Cupertino City Council, and then they say this is a temporary fix for the express lane. But then why we want to waste taxpayer money, $170 million for a temporary fix, and then not doing a vigorous and then real solution, the light rail? So I'm sorry I ran out of my time, but I'll come back probably next meeting. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. Next speaker is Cheryl Jensen.
Mayor and City Council, thank you for another opportunity to address you. I would also like to talk about your performance agreement. Item number 14 says that the Traffic Authority agrees that no new freeway lanes shall be constructed in the Route 85 median or in the shoulders of Route 85 within the geographical limits of the town without prior written approval of the council of the town. Now, as far as I know, nobody has really given any approval for this, and yet it is steamrolling ahead. They did an initial study, negative declaration, environmental assessment. The comments were due from you on February 28th. February 28th has passed. I don't know if you sent any agreements. I never saw any or heard any of these comments for this proposal that they're doing. It's steamrolling ahead. You've already missed the deadline. There is only one thing now you can do, and that is stand up and defend your agreement. And that's what you have. That's the tool that's left for you. Because if you go to court, if you try to go to court on the environmental issues, you're going to have to depend on what I wrote. Each one of you received what I wrote in your mail, or you should have. And you could depend on that in court. But you did not respond, and now all you have left is to defend the agreement. It's a firm agreement. Public Utility Code 100126 set up VTA from the Santa Clara County Transportation Authority, which preceded it. And all the contracts went with VTA, and they're as bound to this contract as any other entity would be. So I ask you, please, join with Cupertino, join with the City of Saratoga, join with Campbell, and defend the agreements, because every city had this similar agreement, but the town of Los Gatos agreement was the firmest, and you have more basis to defend it. Now, we just cannot have another lane in this through this West Valley just to back up all these choke points. We have a non-working freeway, and we've got to not let this happen.
Thank you. Next speaker, Jeff Lowridge.
Jeff Lockridge. I live on 109 Paseo Loro. I also want to talk about the proposed Highway 85 toll lanes. I have some questions regarding the proposed Highway 85 toll lanes, and as I understand it, the plan is to place toll lanes on Highway 85 connecting Highway 87 and Highway 280. The toll road will start and stop at these two highways. It will allow trucks, changing the truck ban currently in place. I thought we had some agreement with Caltrans regarding some of these issues. For anyone who regularly commutes on this freeway now, this toll road proposal makes no sense. There will be a monumental backup at each end of the toll road. There's already a huge backup now. It will also raise the sound level, which is already over the limit now. What is Los Gatos doing about this? Will there be public hearings for the residents? I thought we had already paid for this freeway and that we had reserved space for a light rail line. When did this change? This project will cost millions and won't solve any traffic congestion. It'll just add to it. I'd suggest that the town have some official outreach meetings so that we all can be educated about this project and its effect on our town and its residents. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Spector.
I don't know if you're finished with the speakers, but may I have a question of staff?
Yes, go on ahead.
Given the questions that have been raised by the speakers, can you tell us what, if any, plans Los Gatos has on this issue?
Yes. Staff informed the council on Friday, February 21st that we were submitting comments in response to the environmental assessment. Those comments were submitted before the February 28th deadline, contrary to what one of the speakers just told you. Those comments identified specific deficiencies in the notification and description of the proposed project, and the comments from the town identified the performance agreement that was presented to you tonight and asked for response from VTA as the successor agency to the predecessor agency that the town signed that agreement with. We do not have that response yet from VTA to our comments. We expect those responses will be provided as the environmental review process continues. The mayor and I met with the other West Valley mayors and managers last week, and the primary subject of discussion was Highway 85, and Cupertino, Saratoga, and Los Gatos all shared their respective concerns. Staff has not taken and will not take a position in support or opposition to the project in advance of the council's consideration of that, which is tentatively scheduled for April or May by the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. No further questions. We have one more speaker on the subject, which is Mary Robertson.
Good evening, Council. I'd just like to confirm what everybody else has said before. You did have a performance agreement. One item which I don't think was read was item 15, Part B, for design of all interchanges, grid structures, and grading to accommodate future transit operations in the corridor, including the extension of the existing Vasona rail into the median of Route 85. If that median's gone, you have no opportunity to do that. In addition, I'd also like to bring up the project study report, which was done signed off by Caltrans October 28th, 2010. Page 22 of this project study report regarding adding the lanes on Highway 85 indicates that it will pretty well be obsolete by 2023 to the 2028 timeframe. And what they will do at that point, they probably will no longer be able to allow SOVs in the lane, or if they do, the prices are going to go way up, or they may change the carpool factor to 3 or more. In addition, I've just read recently that the 3 or more carpooling information was brought up at MTC and Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and they did studies on that, and they said if the carpooling changed to 3 or more, that it would actually decrease carpooling by 75%. So now I go back to the green gentleman over here. By adding these extra lanes in here, you are not creating a green environment for this valley. I encourage you to stick to your performance agreement and insist on light rail. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Carol Tinsley.
I'm not that tall. Hi, I'm Carol Tinsley. I am a 12-year resident of Los Gatos, and I've been pretty involved in our schools and volunteering in our schools, and I really just wanted to make the community aware that there's a board meeting that's going to be held at the Los Gatos Union School District next Tuesday night, where they're going to be talking about math adoption. That's very important. As all of you know, the reputation of the town and the reputation of the schools are very closely aligned. Recently, there was a math pathway that was taken away at Fisher Middle School, which took away the ability of kids starting with this 6th grade class to reach calculus in 11th grade, which is important for any technical college applications. Kids want to have calculus if they're interested in going into engineering or architecture or anything. So it's very, very important. I have some flyers for people to become advised on this, and there's also a petition to sign, and there's also an email address if you'd like to make your comments known to the Board of Trustees. There's been a pretty big group, parent group, working on this matter, and so far we haven't gotten a lot of positive feedback that our concerns are being heard over there. So we urge the town to look into it and, try to get the community aware, because it's very important for our housing values and more than anything for the future of our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tinsley.
Should I leave them somewhere, or can I leave them somewhere?
Please hand them to the clerk.
Okay.
Mr. Manager, being that there are a lot of concerns about this subject and taking into consideration noticing requirements and what this council can and can't do, can you comment on if this council would like, or if this council is able to, number one, have a public hearing on this matter, number two, what this council could do as individuals?
Yes, as the council is aware, and for the public's information, the town of Los Gatos has no authority over operation or curricular decisions of public schools operating within the town of Los Gatos. In terms of holding a formal public hearing, we have no legal authority to do so. Certainly the council could hold a public meeting on any subject they so chose, and could also take individual actions as council members may choose. What the town has historically done in our past practice and precedent is when issues like this come to the town that are really within the authority and jurisdiction of another governmental agency, is we refer those issues to that agency. When the school board is having a public meeting on this matter, we could use our communication link through nextdoor.com to reach the affected neighborhoods, as well as possibly our What's New email blast to inform the community of the school board's upcoming discussion. But the town has no authority to take any action on the curricular decisions by itself.
Thank you. And certainly individual council members, if they want to show up at the school board meeting, could show up and speak as individuals, but not necessarily on behalf of the council. So, Vice Mayor.
I just wanted to ask Ms. Tinsley to come up and tell us the email address.
The email address for the Board of Trustees is boardmembers@lgusd.k12.ca.us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is the last card I have under verbal communications. So moving on to our public hearings. Our first hearing this evening is Architecture and Site Application S-13-071 and S-13-080, property location 16560 Shannon Road. And this is the appeal of a planning commission decision denying a request to demolish a pre-1941 single-family residence and construct 2 new single-family residences on a property zoned R18. There is also an addendum on this item, and I would like to refer to Ms. Erin Walters, our associate planner, for the staff report.
Good evening, Mayor and Council members. On January 8th, the applicant presented the 3 applications that were just stated. The Planning Commission approved the subdivision for the property but denied both architecture and site applications due to concerns regarding neighborhood compatibility with regard to massing and appropriateness of 2-story homes at this location, and also with concerns regards to the size of the proposed home located at Lot 2 being 148 square feet larger than the next largest home in the immediate neighborhood. The project was appealed on January 10th by the applicant, claiming that the commission erred in stating that the proposed projects were not compatible with an immediate neighborhood. The appellant also has other claims which are attached in the staff report and will be presented this evening. As a part of the addendum, the appellant has submitted a modified plan for the home on Lot 2. The proposed plans reduce the house by a total of 158 square feet and also reduces the attached garage. The changes are minor and architectural elevation details do remain the same. The reduction in square footage is achieved by shrinking the total house by a foot on each elevation, and by reducing that square footage, the proposed house will no longer be the largest home in the immediate neighborhood based on total square footage. The modified house at Lot 2 would still be the second largest FAR in the immediate neighborhood, and the proposed house on Lot 1 will be the largest FAR in the immediate neighborhood. Both homes are within the allowable FAR for each site, each lot, and meet all zoning requirements. Staff believes the revised plans have a minimal effect on the application, and therefore staff does not feel this new information would trigger a remand to Planning Commission. You also received a desk item tonight, which includes a map of the subject property and the town boundaries, as well as 3 letters in support of the project. This concludes staff's presentation, and staff's available for questions.
Thank you. Does council have any questions of staff at this time? Does council wish to make any disclosures? Councilmember Brzezinski?
Yes, I met with the appellant, and I visited the site at least 3 times as late as this evening on the way down to council.
Vice Mayor?
I also met with the appellant and have visited and or gone by the site almost daily.
I met with the applicant/appellant, and I go by the site more than one time daily, many times daily.
I have met with the appellants, and I have visited the property, although I don't go by it daily.
And I've also met with the appellant, and I've also visited the site.
Thank you. At this point in time, I'd like to call the appellant/applicant forward to make your presentation. You have 10 minutes.
Good evening, Mayor and Vice Mayor and council members. Thank you for allowing us to come back and discuss the project on Shannon Road that everybody drives by almost every day. Up here we got a picture of the proposed properties, craftsman style homes that have met all design guidelines by residential design guidelines. The residential design guidelines, the Planning Commission erred by only limiting their decision to the immediate neighborhood and not considering potentially expanding the decision to the expanded neighborhood. And I'd like to describe that tonight. So the residential design guidelines, as written, talk about getting the greatest attention, not the only attention. The greatest attention is given to the immediate neighborhood. The Planning Commission stated that their decision was they could only look at the immediate neighborhood and quote from their hands were tied when looking past the immediate neighborhood. But as you can see in the residential guidelines as they're written, immediate neighborhood gets greatest attention, not the only attention. This photo shows the site with the yellow boundaries, and around it with the pink boundary is what the immediate neighborhood is, as described by the residential design guidelines. And across the street from the proposed project is the church. Now, within the neighborhood, the orange blocked properties are all two-story properties. When you look at just West La Chiquita and East La Chiquita, there are 54 homes on those two streets. Interesting enough, 27 of the homes are two-story, and 27 of the homes are single-story. So the expanded neighborhood of East and West La Chiquita are 50% two-story properties. Many of them much larger than the proposed properties. This diagram shows the residential design guidelines, exactly how they are written. And the wording is, common sense should be used when applying the diagram to specific site context. Also below the wording, it talks about interpretation of the immediate neighborhood in a standard subdivision. Well, there's actually not too many standard subdivisions around Los Gatos, and this area is clearly not a standard subdivision, as you've got the church across the street that's 45 feet tall, and then if you go up Shannon, you've got the fire station, and further you have the classrooms of Sher Hadash. So clearly not a standard subdivision. So per the guidelines, since these guidelines are written for standard subdivisions, we'd like to look a bit further into the expanded neighborhood. And because the church, as per the guidelines, takes up about 3 of the properties in the prior diagram, which is 11 properties around the subject site, the church takes up 3 of those. So if you expand the immediate neighborhood to include just 2 more homes that sit 1 house outside of the defined immediate neighborhood, which are defined by 9 and 10 right there, actually includes a 3,409 square foot home on Shannon Road and a 3,050 square foot home on West La Chiquita. So again, 1 house further outside of the immediate neighborhood, and you've got homes larger than both of the proposed projects. This is a view standing, if you're on the front lawn of the proposed properties, looking across Shannon Road, looking at the church. Definitely not a standard subdivision. The church is actually on land that's zoned residential. So down the, not that the church is going to go anywhere, but if at some point it is actually zoned residential. So you can't compare it to, because there's not residential homes there, but if there were. And what I've got here are properties. These are the 2 homes that are on each side of the 1 house outside the expanded immediate neighborhood. Next. These are properties, if you're coming down Shannon and towards the project past Hilo, on the right, again, you've got the fire station and the church. On the other side, you've got large 2-story properties on Shannon Road leading up to the proposed project. And when you go down West La Chiquita, there are 2 large 2-story properties scattered all along the street. This is just some of them. And when you go around to East La Chiquita, again, 2-story properties larger than the proposed homes up and down the street. Again, 50% of the homes are already 2-story. And these are examples of some of those 2-story homes. So that is kind of why we feel that the Planning Commission has erred in not looking outside the expanded neighborhood. Now, we'd like to build these homes, and in conceding, we do hope that the council approves the proposed plans that were already on the table. But to keep things moving forward, if you did not agree with that, we brought in new information and would concede 158 feet of Lot 2, which would bring the Lot 2 home to 10 feet smaller than the largest home in the immediate neighborhood. And these are the plans. They're also on the wall up there, and you've seen plans, elevations to construct the property. And Ms. Walters already described the properties to you. If there's any questions, we're available. I appreciate your time and allowing us to discuss the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Does council have any? Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. What I don't see in your presentation is the house immediately to the west of you on Shannon. That's a one-story, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And in looking at the Planning Commission minutes, the Planning Commission did talk about the church, but as my understanding is, they indicated that because it was a church, it was basically irrelevant to the consideration of the context of the residential neighborhood. Is that your recollection, or do you have a different position?
That was discussed. That's correct.
And my next and final question is, how would you address the issue of including properties that aren't in the town of Los Gatos and therefore aren't subject to the town of Los Gatos residential design guidelines as a marker, if you will, or as a comparison for your proposed houses, because they're not subject to the same rules?
As all of us and many drive by the property frequently, there are properties that are in the town and in the county. It's part of the neighborhood. I mean, people or guests or residents are driving in, they're not thinking, oh, there's a county home and there's a town home. It's the neighborhood. And I mean, it's how these homes are going to fit into the neighborhood is the way that we design the home. We design the homes with all of the residential design guidelines. We had no variances, no exceptions, had staff support going into the commission meeting, and the town architect had no recommendations for change on the properties. But we just feel it's part of the neighborhood. I mean, the church is part of the neighborhood. You drive by, there it is. Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, I would like to invite anyone who has not filled out a speaker card who would like to speak on this subject to do so. And our first speaker is Brad McCurdy.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'm Brad McCurdy, and I'm an architect with Terry Martin Architects across the street. And I came just out to support the idea that there are certain properties that sort of fall through the cracks of the residential design guidelines as they're applied in Los Gatos. And it's very easy to find properties where if one goes 2 houses away and reanalyzes the immediate neighborhood context, one comes up with an entirely different solution to what the context is. And there's a book by Christopher Alexander called A Pattern Language that we all study in architecture school. And the way he notes the way people perceive space is based on blocks and streets. And as was presented, when one drives down those streets, fully 50% of those houses are 2-story, 50% are 1-story. But when one looks at the way that the diagram in the residential design guidelines is applied, it makes it seem like it's not permitted to do a 2-story home in a context that would very much support that. So as architects, we're a little concerned that there's a little bit of an onerous burden being placed on homeowners that just happen to fall in a lot where the analysis based on the design guidelines is being overly restrictively applied and isn't really the intent of creating a community that actually has a context that's followed and used for the purpose of creating a good design. And a mix that arbitrarily ignores, for instance, the church across the street because it's a church rather than a residence is also somewhat unfair when the bulk of that church is presented to the people driving by a site as part of the context of the community. And as the applicant stated when he responded to your question, Ms. Vice Mayor, I don't think that it's fair to assume that someone driving down a street will be able to analyze whether a property is incorporated, unincorporated, or which community that it's incorporated into. One just perceives that when you drive down the street, fully 50% of the houses are two-story. And I don't think it's at all unreasonable to a client trying to build a good house designed well per the design guidelines to just arbitrarily deny their project based on a narrow view rather than a more holistic view. So I'm just here to speak my piece about hoping everyone will pull out to more of a 20,000-foot view rather than a single elevation view and look at the context and look at the design and, with an eye on fairness, not necessarily on approval, but a fair, holistic attitude rather than a closed. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Next speaker. Oh, we have a question for you.
Sorry, Ms. Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Before you run away, thank you, Mr. McCurdy. Let me try my question with you. If I am tasked as a planner or a town council member with trying to interpret the rules for development in Los Gatos, then one would assume that I'd follow the residential design guidelines that apply to Los Gatos. Whether I know what the boundary is or not, the question is, if I am planning for Los Gatos, shouldn't I be looking at those properties that are subject to the rules of Los Gatos rather than default to properties that aren't subject to those rules to then push Los Gatos towards that non-rule, if you will, which you're advocating, versus trying to push Los Gatos as we incorporate those other properties to what the standards are for Los Gatos. Do you have a response to that?
Sure, and I guess I should clarify, I'm not necessarily advocating two-story homes. I'm not necessarily advocating any size or any shape. What I am advocating is that I have noticed in the past 7 years, particularly, a gradual tendency for Los Gatos to close their definition of what they're looking at around a site rather than broadening it. About 7-8 years ago when we were doing homes like this, there was a bigger discussion about blocks and, neighborhoods rather than a more confined, 5 to 8, lot discussion. And I just don't think that it's reasonable to a property owner on a boundary condition to arbitrarily negate some of the things that one sees when you're in that condition. So I guess I would just say that if I were in the exact opposite role and a two-story home were supported by the guidelines, but if one drove around the whole neighborhood, that L-shaped piece was a unreasonably two-story mass in a field of otherwise one story, I wouldn't think it any more appropriate to design a two-story home in that scenario than it is in this case. Does that make sense? Okay.
I hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Spector has a question for you, Mr. McCurdy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You were saying that there was a point in time that you recall when a broader perspective was taken. You see it now as being more limited. Do you know if that change occurred after the residential design guidelines were adopted?
After, yes, but not because of. I've seen it seemingly more and more closed and more minute neighborhood context gradually. I mean, each and every case over the past 7 years seems like it's, and in some cases we've actually seen the Planning Commission admonish staff for their staff report not necessarily taking into account all of the homes within the neighborhood context because there are arbitrarily homes that don't appear to be, quote, well-designed or conforming to the standards. So there was this desire to ignore those as if they were somehow less valued as part of the context because they weren't, quote, good design. So I think there's been a gradual reduction of the number of surrounding context pieces that are considered as part of the holistic view of a neighborhood.
less than even the design guidelines allow for?
At times, I do feel like it's been pretty obvious that fewer homes even than the guidelines have been truly, I think, valued as part of the context, because there is a desire to create a certain feeling in the town. And I think that the design guidelines actually seek to stop that agenda and rather substitute an actual impartial analysis of the surrounding neighborhood context. And I think any impartial analysis of this neighborhood context when one drives around it, I mean, I certainly don't have a dog in this fight, so to speak, but driving down the street, it's pretty obvious that it's a 50-50 mixed area of two-story and one-story home. And to arbitrarily, just because this particular lot is the center lot of a just sort of coincidental strip of homes that are one story, it seems very short-sighted and narrowly focused rather than contextually, oriented.
Do you feel as though we should amend our residential design guidelines?
I don't know that that's necessary, but I also don't know that I don't think it would be a bad thing if one were to include a slightly broader neighborhood context in the discussion of any given lot. There are times when an entire street are 2 stories facing one direction with backyards that butt up to all just coincidentally 1-story homes. And in that case, the person that's in that context is looked down on by their neighbor, I mean, literally from a 2nd-story window, yet is told that when they redo their home, they can't do 2 stories. So there are situations like that.
Thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none, the next speaker, thank you, Mr. McCurdy, is Jeff Ratcliffe.
Good evening, Mayor Leonardis and council members. So I've been a resident of Los Gatos for 49 years, and I've been getting kind of confused listening to all this stuff tonight. I remember back in 92, my wife and I we lived on Farley Road, which was clearly majority of single-family residences, single stories, that is, for many, many blocks, and we took a 1,500-square-foot house and blew it up to, well, not blew it up, but tore it down and put a 2nd story in there, and it was about 3,100 square feet. And looking back, I'm thinking, what's changed? If we're not looking at that, as some speakers have talked about before, about that expanded neighborhood or helicopter view. If you've driven past the subject property, you probably more than likely driven by my home as well, because I'm about 4 houses away, also on a corner lot. And I'm very much in support of the plans that the applicants have put together. The design seems that's very compatible with a lot of the other construction that's been going on recently as well in those general areas. And my wife and I have a letter of support that I believe you have on file, and we too are interested in maybe doing some type of an expansion down the line. So I just in agreement with all that's been said earlier tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lonnie Oswalt.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I appreciate this opportunity to come here and speak in support of this project, and I believe you also have a letter from me on this subject. My business is located at Mobile Frame at 101 Blossom Hill Road, which used to be a AAA building you're all probably familiar with and probably have driven by on a daily basis. We won a beautification award there for some of the improvements that we made to the property. One of the things I've always been in favor of is applying common sense. And Barbara, you asked, should that guideline be revised, and I think it needs to be revised. Because when you end up with a situation here where someone is bringing a really nice development to the table, to this community, and they're complying with all the ordinances, your general plan, it's not up to the Planning Commission to rewrite the general plan. There's no variance on the table here. And the project as presented is a wonderful asset to our community. I assume they're going to be paying school impact fees. It's going to bring additional business to the community. It's going to establish 2 new wonderful homes that people are going to become citizens in our community and live in those homes. So when I see all this going on, I see this as a humongous waste of our time, because I granted good intent in writing these guidelines, but when you see a project like this staled in this kind of process, and I've driven by the project myself, it's just nonsense. It's very much consistent with the neighborhood, and there's no variance again. And I'm hopeful that you'll pass the plans as they were originally presented and not force the applicant to reduce the square footage. I just see no need for that. No one driving by that house is ever going to ascertain that it's 158 square feet less than as originally proposed. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no more speaker. Oh, please come forward. If anybody else has a card and they would like to speak on this subject, please give your card to the clerk.
Good evening, Council. My name is Howie Spinner, and one thing I wanted to first point out. In 1980, I got my job. My first job was at Intel. I was a quality engineer, and I was right out of college. I'm scratching my head, thinking, okay, now how do I do this job? How do I figure this out? And so my first realization was, okay, we got all these specs, and so if the part meets all the specs, well, then it's a green light and ship it. And if the part doesn't meet one of the specs, well, then it's a reject. And I thought, oh my gosh, this job's going to be a breeze. And until the first problem occurred where some product line was going to be shut down, at this actually pretty small company at that time. And that's when I learned the term a business decision. And there was a lot of business decisions that were made at Intel. And, they would go to a customer maybe and say, hey, Mr. Customer, it doesn't meet this spec. So anyway, what I learned was how to use logic and reason in my job as a quality engineer. And I think there's some applicability here to this situation. Yeah, there's some guidelines. It says the greatest, emphasis or something like that. But still, there needs to be some logic and reason. I've always put logic and reason. I'm a business owner now for 30 years. I've always put logic and reason as the foremost part of my decision making. Have hard problems. You're a small business owner. You're in a situation. I can get emotional, but you put that aside and you just focus on the logic and the reason. I'm familiar with the Shannon Road project. I drive there several times a week. The orange netting on the subject property's been up there so long it's starting to grow on me. It hardly deserves mention. These 2 new homes will be built to current code and regulations, which is a significant upgrade technically than the home that on there originally was. With the recent square footage, I think there's a nice consideration there. I think that shows the integrity of the applicant in regards to this project and our great town ideals. On a secondary note, someone else had mentioned this also. It's going to help the local employment. Money is going to flow down to other merchants, stores, and restaurants. I think it's time to approve this application with logic and reason so everyone can move forward in the most efficient and productive way to help improve the beauty of the town of Los Gatos. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ann Robinson.
Hi, Ann Robinson. I actually live off of Shannon. I drive down that road every day. My main concern with the orange mesh is that there doesn't seem to be any yard. It seems to be taking up the entire lot, the 2 homes. And I'm just wondering if this is going to set a precedent for other lots in that area, if people are going to want to subdivide their home or their lot once they demolish their home. So I I think we should stay with current guidelines and not bend the rules to accommodate the current proposal for these two homes. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Lee Quintana.
Lee Quintana, 5 Palm Avenue. I agree that the speakers who spoke in favor of the project seem very logical. However, I think there's another way of looking at this. The guidelines were developed in order to implement the goals and policies of the general plan. And one of the things that I think often does not happen is when a specific project comes before the Planning Commission or the Town Council, that tie back into the general plan is often not made. And what I mean by that is that our general plan has a community design element. There are a lot of shalls in that element. However, the guidelines have very few shalls. There are more guidelines on how to meet the shalls of the general plan. The general plan also has a statement in it that says that a project is not considered consistent with the general plan unless it forwards the goals of the general plan and implements the intent of the policies. I think the problem with projects like this is that any project, if you move out the boundaries of the area, you're going to be able to argue that it's consistent with that. However, very often we have projects that come before us and we're told that they're in transitional neighborhoods. How did they get to be a transition neighborhood? And do we want to continue that transition, or do we want to try and follow the goals of our general plan to try and preserve the character of our neighborhoods as they are?
That was the last card I have for the public comments on this. So I'd like to invite the applicant back up, appellant. You have 5 minutes to rebut, add to, enhance your previous presentation.
Thank you. The current guidelines do allow for two-story homes. There are two-story homes in the immediate neighborhood, which even in its reduced sample size because of the church, there still are two-story homes in that area. Again, there were no variances. There were under the FAR, everything was designed to meet the FAR, to meet the residential design guidelines as they're written. Even being a two-story home actually allows for a greater yard, and these homes definitely were designed for a family coming into town to have a nice yard for their family, and the two-story home actually allows for a greater yard on the properties. That's about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing portion of this, and we will look to council for a discussion or a motion on this. Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm really glad that I'm sure the applicant's not, but I'm really glad that we had this project come before us as an appeal, because what I think you've seen tonight from the testimony that we've heard so far is that we have a real interesting policy discussion I think that council needs to have right now. This has come up before, but I don't think it has come up in quite as severe a situation as what we are seeing this evening. So I want to throw out a few thoughts just regarding the policy issue and then see where everyone else is at. This language, I was on the General Plan Committee when this was first drafted, and I personally spent a lot of time trying to figure out the exact right words to use that would balance being clear and specific with giving us the flexibility that we need because, as someone pointed out, we don't have that many places in the town of Los Gatos that are standard subdivisions. I'm just looking around at where all of us live up here, and there aren't any, I don't think, that live in standard subdivisions. We have so many different factors that we need to consider for each of our neighborhoods that we have to have some level of flexibility, and that's why we don't have the shells that Ms. Quintana was talking about. So when I look at the section of the residential design guidelines, what I come to is, first of all, this idea of standard subdivision. So in my mind, a standard subdivision means houses on both sides of the streets, lots of about equal size. I don't think that you can call this area a standard subdivision because of the church and the fire station, as well as the different size lots that are surrounding it. Then we get into the issue of, well, do you count the church? Do you count the fire station? And in my definition, of course, I have my own definition of neighborhood, which is a neighborhood is as far as you'll go to borrow a rake. I mean, I've always used that, so I use that more than the little blocks. But I think that neighborhoods come in all shapes and sizes. Some neighborhoods are adjacent to commercial areas. Some have schools, some have parks, some have churches, some have fire departments. Those are part of that neighborhood. It's a different neighborhood, but it's still a neighborhood. Then this whole issue of, is it county or is it town? And I agree with the comments of our architect friend that the average person driving down, not even an average person, no one's going to be able to know, is this a town residence? Is this on county property? And and we got a map that was provided to us as part of the desk item, and actually this property is totally surrounded in its immediate neighborhood by county properties. So if we don't pay attention to county properties, well, then where do we look? Well, then we have to go around the corner on Englewood, and when we look at the map of Englewood, those lots look to be, just eyeballing it, twice the size, and the homes are in the 4,000 square foot range. So that doesn't make any sense either. And making sense comes back to, I think, some real key words in the design guidelines, and that is common sense and being aware that every neighborhood needs to be evaluated individually and differently, depending on their situation. So again, when I look at this language, there are all kinds of words in here about when this diagram may not be applicable. These factors include but are not limited to. Again, we worked very hard to try to give us the tools to work with to take into account all of the unique assets, also known as problems and challenges sometimes, that we have to deal with when we're making these kinds of land use decisions. So, as I said, I'm glad we had an opportunity, or we have an opportunity tonight to talk about this, because I do think it has come up more, and it would be nice to get some clarification on the part of council for both staff and planning commission going forward. And oh, by the way, we also have to make a decision on the application and appeal that's before us tonight.
Thank you. Vice Mayor?
I appreciate that there are policy discussions and policy issues, but tonight we actually are considering an appeal of a decision by the Planning Commission, which limits our discretion to determining whether they made an error. And what we need to do is determine, was there error or abuse of discretion? Was there new information submitted to the council tonight that wasn't available to the Planning Commission, or was there a decision made by the Planning Commission that involved a policy issue? The Planning Commission followed the guidelines that were in place and interpreted them reasonably, which is not to say that there could be another interpretation, but two differing interpretations that are equally reasonable doesn't mean that one was in error. It just means that you disagree with the one that you don't like. So the question to me is, if I'm going to discuss policy, is to use Councilwoman McNutt's analysis, or Mr. McCurdy's, if I drive down the street, do I know which town I'm in? Well, I could do that. I could drive down Winchester, and pretty soon I'd be in Campbell. Pretty soon I'd be in San Jose. Pretty soon I'd be wherever I'd be, Santa Clara. Would I know the difference? Not necessarily if I was from out of town and reading the signs, but why do we pay attention to whether there's a difference? Because we can control what our community looks like, or at least try to do that. So if we put residential design guidelines in place, and when I was working on them, walking the neighborhoods, I agree, they're very different. I think there's probably one area, maybe two, that I can think of in Los Gatos that are actually what we think of as a standard subdivision. But we did, in walking the streets, try to come up with a context where we could view what would happen to a particular structure. So then my question is, well, am I going to apply those rules or guidelines to the houses that also have to follow those rules, or houses that don't? And to be quite cynical, I could say that I've seen a lot of people advocating a project who expand the neighborhood to get until they get to the thing that they want to build. And that may or may not be what's going on tonight, but it's hard for me to compare residences that don't have to follow Los Gatos rules with proposed residences that do. So am I going to try to do a long-range planning that creates similar things that have to follow our rules, or am I going to do long-range planning that just follows that doesn't have to follow our rules? So I have trouble in expanding a context where it doesn't necessarily apply. I agree there aren't any variances. Variance is unusual. I agree that they haven't really broken rules, but when I look at the Planning Commission discussion, what I see is quite unusually Commissioner O'Donnell being the person who thought that the houses were not compatible with the neighborhood, and was discussing the question of whether or not the guidelines, however you interpreted them, whether you thought they were silly, whether you thought they were nonsense, whether you thought whatever they were, that the Planning Commission certainly didn't have the ability to change them, and that their interpretation was, I think, therefore reasonable. I don't think it was an error. I don't think that they could have this policy discussion. We can, but I don't think we can have it tonight, because I don't think that that would be fair to the Planning Commission or the applicants or anyone else if we're actually going to do an analysis of how the policy should be changed, if it should be. So my only question is there new information that we have tonight that wasn't available that would cause us to send this back to the Planning Commission in light of discussion or the new plans that we've received? I'm not ready to make a motion. I'd like to hear from other council people.
Councilmember Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I, too, sat on the council when we went through the discussion of the revision of the residential design guidelines. And I think that when you consider what Ms. Quintana said, that we're attempting to forward the goals of the general plan, you have to put in the context of what are the goals of the general plan. We want to maintain the character of our neighborhoods. Particularly, we want to be able to protect our neighbors from unnecessary impacts. And we want to make sure that we create quality in those developments that we do approve and move forward with. And I think as a community we've done really well. I will tell you frankly, I know exactly when I'm leaving Los Gatos and going to Campbell. And I don't have to see the Campbell city limit sign. I do think that we have been able to maintain the character on our residential neighborhoods. It's part of that kind of grand vision that the general plan reflects. I also think that as one of the members who sat in the discussions, both at the General Plan Committee and on Council, when we did the revise of the residential design guidelines, I remember looking at that diagram of the houses on either side and across the street and behind, and I know the context of our decision. And the word immediate was defined clearly at that time. Now, maybe passage of time can change recollection, but it was the immediate neighborhood defined as those several houses primarily because of the impacts that would occur on those neighbors. Okay, but I also distinctly remember that the word immediate was in a context of, well, if you have an immediate neighborhood, you must have another neighborhood, a greater neighborhood, a larger neighborhood, or the neighborhood. And for me, as I go into a neighborhood, I can tell when I'm in a new neighborhood. It very much is defined by the street and the context where I'm entering. And we had a decision just a couple of weeks ago about a neighborhood definition over on Loma Alta. And it's intriguing because we did look at the immediate houses, but we had people testifying who were a street over, further up Loma Alta, saying, this is our neighborhood. We really feel we want to maintain the character of this neighborhood. And it was the content of those evaluations that I think helped us understand and approve the decision at that point in time. I don't think it's a question tonight of rewriting the design guidelines. I think the design guidelines are fine. I think it's a question of interpretation of the design guidelines. And how do you do it? Rationally, logically? How do you do it with reason? How do you look at these design guidelines and say, how do we achieve the goals of the general plan, which are to continue to enhance and evolve our wonderful residential community? For me, I think that my own surveying of this neighborhood does include the La Chiquita loop, does include the residences that are along Shannon beyond the fire station itself, not because they are in the immediate neighborhood, but because they are the neighborhood. And I see it as unique. If I'm going down Inglewood, that is part of the neighborhood. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which we define neighborhood. I'd say, for my purposes, it's not a question, did the Planning Commission err? I think it's a policy issue that they probably weren't able to appropriately deal with when they were looking at the language of the immediate neighborhood as so defined. Okay, I would like to think that tonight we can discuss this from the point of view of policy and how we do understand what it's about, and in particular, what are we trying to achieve? What is the language of the design guidelines? What's it attempting to achieve? Is it a mathematical equation? I don't think so. I think it's a development of character, and that's what we need to look at. So to me, I want us to discuss how this particular property can perhaps be used in helping us define what the residential design guidelines are really attempting to achieve and what that policy is. I would not find the Planning Commission in error. I would think that it's just a question of they were doing their job, interpreting the rules as defined on the page, but we're not feeling comfortable expanding it beyond what they saw in the definition of immediate neighborhood.
Further comments or discussion? Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a little different take on this application in that in reading through it, in reading through the materials, and actually paying a lot of time, paying attention to the Planning Commission, a lot of concepts evolved for me, sort of like peeling an onion. In reading the Planning Commission staff report, I had concerns. One of the concerns was that the staff stated that the only reason that this application was going forward to the Planning Commission was because they didn't want to create the largest home in the neighborhood. That concerns me because I don't, in my opinion, see that as the reason an item would go to the Planning Commission only because you didn't want to create the largest home in the neighborhood. So I think that is something that we're going to have to take a look at. Another thing that came up that was of concern to me was the perceived authority of the town architect. the perceived authority that I saw accepted by the staff, that I saw accepted by the applicant, that I saw not accepted this time by the Planning Commission. And I'm glad that this council is going to revisit the issue of the authority of the architect, because I think that perceived authority may be giving misdirection to not only the Planning Commission and to staff, but more significantly to me, to applicants. I find this discussion of what the guidelines should or should not have, what policy underlies those guidelines, interesting, because those guidelines, I think, were adopted by this council, I believe, in 2008. Which wasn't that long ago. And as a member of the council and as a member of that general plan committee that worked on the residential guidelines, we did walk from house to house. We did look at all of the characteristics of those homes. We were fully aware of the types of neighborhoods that Los Gatos did or did not have. We had exactly the same kind of discussions that I'm hearing so far here this evening. And with those discussions, we came to the decisions that are encompassed in our residential guidelines. I agree. I thought Mr. O'Donnell was spot on. He looked at sheets A4 and A5, and I felt as though he was applying the residential guidelines the way they were intended to be applied. I met with the appellants. They're very nice people. If you do things because you like people, then you would grant the appeal. But that's not what I think we do up here. We look at the rules, we look at our guidelines, we look at our ordinances, and based on all of that, I just don't see that the Planning Commission erred.
Further discussion. I have a question for staff. And this was brought up, and maybe the public isn't as familiar with this rule, but the 300-foot rule. I know that this property was annexed. It used to be part of the county less than a year ago. And because, can you explain why it was necessary for them to become part of the town and what the 300-foot rule means?
From what I understand, the project was annexed into the town because they wanted to subdivide. They wanted to subdivide the property and build 2 homes on it. So are you asking about the legal noticing requirements?
I guess, what was the necessity to make it become part of the town? Being the discussion that we're having here this evening, if the property was still, quote unquote, a county lot, could they have constructed these homes on the county lot without this kind of discussion? Oh, Sandy, you're going to answer that.
Yes, I can. The town has an agreement with the County of Santa Clara that if there is an intensification of a use on a property that is contiguous to town property or within 300 feet of town property through the way of a road, a public road, that the property owner is required to annex into the town. So if somebody wanted to subdivide their property and go from 1 lot to 2 lots, that would trigger an annexation. Or if somebody wanted to demolish their house and build a new house, that would trigger annexation.
So Councilmember McNutt has a question for you.
Thank you. So just to clarify, so I'm looking at this map that was given to us as part of the desk item, and the only contiguous part is across the street. It's the church property. Otherwise, it's totally surrounded by county residential lots.
That's correct.
Okay.
So, Ms. Bailey, in this neighborhood, based on what Councilmember McNutt just pointed out, we could obviously see this discussion again and have similar, how can I say it, issues moving forward, policy issues moving forward because of the 300-foot rule and because of the number of the county lots in that neighborhood.
That is if somebody wanted to demolish and build a new house. is across the street, then yes, they would need to annex to the town. And depending on what they built, it could either be approved at the Development Review Committee level or the Planning Commission level.
One more question I have for you is, I found it curious in the discussion of the Planning Commission that the church was zoned R18 and the fire department was zoned R18 and the Shir Hadish was all zoned R18. Is that correct?
I believe those are all R18 zoned properties, and churches are typically located in residential neighborhoods.
Okay. So conceivably, someday the church, if it were to be purchased and heaven forbid, the church goes out of business and someone decides to tear the church down and put housing there, R18, that would be in the town. It's not the county. I'm assuming they would be adhering to our residential design guidelines. However, I would think that based on things have been going in Los Gatos, that it would be like a planned development or something to that effect where the homes would be proposed as two-story homes.
Someone could come in and do a standard subdivision, or they could come in and request a planned development at this time.
All right. Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Bailey? Seeing none. Thank you. Any further discussion, or Vice Mayor?
I'd like to try a motion, if I might. I agree with Councilwoman Spector with respect to the design guidelines, and I also agree that based upon the record in front of us, which is what I want to consider for purposes of the motion, that the Planning Commission did not err. I don't think it's appropriate for us to have a policy discussion tonight that would result in a different action, given that we have a town code section which provides us with only very limited means to overturn a decision of the Planning Commission. So my motion is to uphold the Planning Commission's decision denying architecture and site applications S13071 and S13080, and adopt the resolution denying an appeal of Planning Commission decision denying architecture and site applications. And it is my understanding that if this motion were to be seconded and passed, that would not preclude the applicant from coming back to Planning Commission with a new, different, or revised project. And somebody tell me if I'm wrong.
From what I understand, they could come back to Planning Commission, but they would have to repay their fees for the whole process.
Okay.
New applications.
So my motion is to uphold the decision of the Planning Commission.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Councilmember Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think it is within our purview to ask whether or not we as the council see alternatives available to us, one of which is, even if the determination were that the Planning Commission acted in error, that with new information provided, it would be potentially the opportunity for the council to remand to the Planning Commission with that new information. The staff has indicated that the 100-plus square feet of reduction is not sufficiently significant to return. I think what it really says is that we could act, if we were to attempt to approve this tonight, we could act on the approval and indicate that the square footage is not sufficiently large for us to see this as significant. However, it is a change, and it is a change offered by the applicant. And I, having read the Planning Commission's minutes thoroughly, know that there was a direction of travel that occurred almost at the very beginning that maintained itself throughout the discussion, that we are focused away from just we are focused entirely on the immediate residences in this neighborhood. But there has been some discussion tonight at Council, and I know the Planning Commission pays close attention to what Council says. And I would think that it's possible that we could give the Planning Commission another bite of the apple under the concept that there has been new information provided that might allow the Planning Commission to take another look. Because again, it was presented to the Planning Commission because the number 2 lot was built as the largest house in the general neighborhood. So with that in mind, I don't think I would support the motion. I'd ask the motion maker and the seconder of the motion to consider the possibility that rather than have this start all over again, because I think it definitely offers some value to that particular neighborhood from the architectural as well as the contextual framework, to offer the opportunity for the Planning Commission to take a look at this with the context of our discussion and also with the new information offered by the developer. And that would be a recommendation. Obviously, it's to the maker of the motion and the seconder to consider that or not.
Council Member Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Amending this motion to send this application back to the Planning Commission would be acceptable to the seconder of the motion. However, not simply to look at the new information of a reduction of 150 square feet. Because I was going through all of the bases that the Planning Commission discussed in denying this application. They talked about the garages being dominant front. They talked about canon not being determinative. They talked about residential design guidelines, many factors, and they talk about 2 stories. So if the maker of the motion wants to send this back to the Planning Commission, I would support that. However, not only to examine a reduction in 150 square feet.
Vice Mayor?
So I would consider that as the maker of the motion. I, too, was very concerned that what would happen if it were remanded to the Planning Commission is, number 1, we would have to find the Planning Commission in error, which I have trouble doing. Number 2, that in keeping with Councilwoman Spector's concerns about the perceived authority of the town architect, there would be a perceived approval of the 158 square foot reduction, which is not in keeping with what the Planning Commission did. So while I think it's appropriate for it to go back to the Planning Commission, I would not want it to go with any assumption with respect to the reduction and the revised plans as being appropriate and or somehow tacitly approved. So if the seconder would agree with not finding error, amending the motion to, I guess we would have to accept or grant the appeal and find that there is new information, which is the 158 square foot reduction, and remand to the Planning Commission, but without direction that that 158 square feet reduction is what's going to be the fix, that it be a new concept and a new consideration by the Planning Commission.
Councilmember Spector.
It's acceptable to the seconder, and I hope that the Planning Commission listens to our meeting or looks at the motion carefully.
Further discussion, Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll reluctantly support the motion only because this gives this application a second opportunity, and I think that's what's fair. However, my message to the Planning Commission and to anyone else who's interested is that I think the Planning Commission needs to be more broad-minded in how they are looking at that community and not looking at just one house to either side, which is county property, looking at the bigger context of that community. I'm sorry that we are not thinking about this as a policy decision that we could make this evening. We had 2 meetings ago. We overruled the council majority overruled the Planning Commission on the basis of a policy interpretation. So it's not like something that we never do. So the conversation will continue, and that's always a good thing. So on that basis, I'll support the motion.
Further discussion. Oh, Town Manager.
Yes. I consulted with Community Development Director Sandy Bailey, and the formal action, just to make sure we're hearing the motion correctly, would be to adopt the resolution denying the appeal and remand to the Planning Commission consideration of the architecture and site application without direction. Is that blending the two action items before you?
Okay, can we do that? Can we deny the appeal and remand?
Correct.
Okay, that wasn't the motion because I didn't understand that we could do that. So if we can deny the appeal and remand, given the comments from tonight, then I would do that.
Just remand it. Or you can just remand it straight back without acting on the appeal.
Well, I'd prefer to deny the appeal and remand with the considerations that we've put in the former motion.
And to clarify, there would be some fees, but not the full fees as if it was a new application.
Okay, that's fine. I don't think that's part of my motion.
Further discussion, comments? Councilmember Spector?
I just want to be careful. Thank you, first of all. I want to be careful that the information getting back to the Planning Commission is as encapsulated in the motion by the maker of the motion, because when I heard the manager repeat it just now, it mentioned no direction, and I believe there is direction by the maker of the motion and by me.
Further comments? Councilmember Brzezinski.
I want to make sure we have this motion down, and I'm getting mixed messages here. I understood what the motion originally intended to do was to grant the appeal, remand to the Planning Commission with new information, but in a context of the architecture and site issues that were raised both at the Planning Commission meetings and here, and that would therefore allow the applicant, in this case the appellant, to make a case and make whatever revisions would be appropriate in front of the Planning Commission. I'm not exactly sure why we would not grant the appeal, since not granting the appeal says that we basically accept the Planning Commission's position. That would be my question from the point of view of how we legally actually can do this.
Vice Mayor?
And I guess this is to Mr. Schultz. The original motion was made the way it was because the maker of the motion didn't understand that we had the ability to deny the appeal, thereby finding that the Planning Commission was not in error, and also remand. And so I want to know, is with the discussion that Councilwoman Spector referred to, and if we are able to do that, I would like to do that. If we are not able to deny the appeal and remand with the direction that was indicated in the motion, then I'll go back to the original motion.
Typically, you wouldn't deny or approve it. You'd remand it back with directions. That's how a typical town or city would work. I think they're trying to look up our actual municipal code and find out which sections allow you, whether you can deny and then send it back, or approve it and send it back. But typically, you see this, if there's direction you want, you just remand it back, and that way there aren't the full fees that have to be paid. If it's denied, that usually means fees have to be repaid.
Staff has provided 3 resolutions, none of which exactly meet the motion that was made. So we're trying to find the best way to put it together for you.
In the meantime, any further comments? I'll weigh in on this one. I was going to grant the appeal because I felt like this was a difficult decision for the Planning Commission. This is a neighborhood that, because of the 300-foot rule, because more than likely any house in this neighborhood will get annexed to the town and will probably be torn down or extensively remodeled to the point where it will be a 2-story home, that I felt like this is a kind of a different, unique situation. I also felt as though because of the zoning of the neighborhood and the church across the street, that someday that could potentially be housing, although that might not happen for a very long time. But if it ever were to become housing, they would all be two-story homes. And, you know, based on the consulting architect, I do appreciate the work of the Planning Commission and what they said, and they did extensive deliberation on this, but based on the work of the consulting architect and then the applicant's willingness to reduce this by 158 feet, so it's no longer one of the largest or the largest home in the immediate neighborhood, I would be willing to grant the appeal, but I might be in the minority here this evening on the council.
If I'm given the mayor's comments and other comments of council, the closest resolution that does not exactly, that was provided to the council previously, is attachment 8, which would require a modification to meet the what appears to be the consensus of the council, but it would be a resolution of the town council granting the appeal but remanding the matter to the Planning Commission for further consideration. However, there is a whereas based on the motion maker and seconder, which would be to strike, whereas council has determined that the Planning Commission erred in its decision, and to strike that whereas.
Okay, now that we're all thoroughly confused,
yes.
I'll go back to my original motion, which was to reluctantly grant the appeal under the Town Code section, wherever it is, 29.20300B2, with respect to new information not available to the Planning Commission, remand it to the Planning Commission with the direction that's been indicated, adopt the resolution that's been referred to by Mr. Larson, striking the portion which indicates that the Planning Commission erred.
Councilmember McNutt.
Given the flow of the discussion, I don't want there to be any surprises on the vote. So previously I said I was going to support the motion, but I cannot.
Further discussion?
Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Brzezinski.
Okay, so if I'm correct in hearing the maker of the motion, it is to grant the appeal, remand to the Planning Commission because of new information, and not to find error, and as so stated by the manager. That is correct, correct? Okay.
A question for staff. If it gets remanded to the Planning Commission, when would that be? And then would it come back to council?
The applicant would first need to revise the plans, and it would need to go back through the review by the staff for evaluation, and then it would go back to the Planning Commission for a decision, and would only come back to council if the matter is appealed.
Thank you. So the seconder of the motion, you approve of all the changes to the motion as discussed? Yes. Okay. Any further discussion? We have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Motion passes 4-1. Councilmember McNutt dissenting. Moving on to other business. A report and actions regarding the Albright Way initiative. Do we have a staff report?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, staff is back to you per your direction on February 3rd. First, I want to orient you to the many documents that have been presented. There was the original staff report provided and posted with the council agenda on Thursday evening. There was an addendum to that staff report on Friday afternoon, which included the proposed settlement agreement as well as a report on work of the ad hoc committee appointed by the mayor. Today there was a desk item that provided some additional clarifications on the settlement agreement. It corrected the signature page to the resolution that is before you tonight, and it provided extensive public comment. And then we also provided an additional late desk item because one page of the public comment that was provided to you earlier was not included, and so we resubmitted that information to you with the complete correspondence from Ms. Lee Quintana. Moving to the staff presentation, hopefully. The Albright project was first approved in 2011 and then rescinded, and then a modified project was approved in June 2013. There has been litigation since then with appeals pending. In the fall, ballot measure petitions were circulated privately, and those were submitted for town review and certification by the Registrar of Voters. That takes us up to your February 3rd town council meeting, at which time the council certified that sufficient signatures had been submitted based on the review process of the Registrar of Voters. There was public comment and questions regarding potential settlement. The council directed a State Elections Code 9212 report, which you'll hear more about shortly. And then the council also approved establishment of an ad hoc committee to consider proposing a potential town-initiated ballot measure. The next day, the mayor appointed himself and Councilwoman Barbara Spector to that ad hoc committee. The presentation tonight will first go over the 9212 report, and then the town attorney will present the settlement agreement as well as the work of the ad hoc committee on a potential town-initiated ballot measure. Then it will come back regarding any questions the council or public have on ballot arguments and positions, and closing with the summary of the actions before the council tonight. For the 9212 report, this was priority work directed by the council to a set of specified issues and questions that the council asked to have addressed, largely comparing the council-approved Albright project to the proposed ballot measure specific plan project. In response to that council direction, I solicited proposals from 3 Bay Area firms and ultimately selected LSA Associates based on their extensive land use experience and prior 9212 report work, their available staff capacity and high-quality references, and their independence. They had had no recent prior Los Gatos engagement, so I felt they would bring that independent review. And in fact, during the course of their work, there were no third-party contacts with the plaintiffs or the defendants regarding the litigation, except for following up on a council question regarding the terms of a Netflix lease. And with that, I would like to introduce Adam Weinstein from LSA Associates, who will present the 9212 report.
Good evening, Mayor Leonardis and Vice Mayor Jensen and council members. As Mr. Larson mentioned, I'm Adam Weinstein. I'm an associate at LSA in Berkeley and one of the authors of the report. Judy Malamut, who was the principal in charge of the report and the managing principal of our Berkeley office, is also here too, and the red turtleneck behind me. And we're really pleased to be here tonight to summarize the report we prepared on the initiative. We have about 6 or 7 slides to show you tonight. So very briefly, I'll walk through the objective of the report, give you a sense of our methods in actually preparing the report, and then we'll go into the actual meat of the report, which really involved honing in on those similarities and differences between that previously approved project that the initiative would rescind and the project that would be developed pursuant to the initiative. And so we looked at these similarities and differences from three different perspectives: physical features, fees, and the more procedural aspects of the approval process. Mr. Larson reviewed some of the background concerning the report itself. So really what this report is an informational document that's intended to provide an objective analysis of the ballot measure and its implications. We focused entirely on the factual elements of the measure, for instance, its effects on planning policies, tax revenue, and infrastructure, and we really scrutinized the initiative itself with all of its associated background documents. And of course, this analysis happened with an understanding of what state law itself allows ballot measures to do. And as Mr. Larson also mentioned, although we collaborated closely with town staff, we did not interview the initiative sponsors or people on the street who might support or oppose the measure. We really just hewed closely to a factual analysis, looking at the two development scenarios for the site based on the documents at hand. And we also did not opine on the merits of the two projects. So the overall goal was not to provide an exhaustive report on the initiative, but to do a detailed side-by-side analysis of the 2013 project and the project that would be developed under the ballot measure, and then in doing so answer the questions that you raised on February 3rd. So here's a quick breakdown of how we went about preparing the report. Our first task, of course, was to understand all of the elements, procedural and substantive, of the previously approved 2013 project, which was, of course, modified by council prior to the approval of the project in June, when the square footage of the built space on the project site that was proposed on the project site was reduced from 550,000 square feet to 485,000 square feet. And so that meant, that review of the 2013 project meant that we looked not only at the approved plans, but the plan development overlay, the conditions of approval required of the project, and then also, of course, the EIR prepared for the project. And so our second task was to go through the same thought process for the initiative, to understand all of its physical and procedural aspects, again, hewing really closely to the factual elements of the ballot measure language and its specific plan, and then, of course, thinking about what's allowed under state law. Our third task was to understand that net difference between the 2013 project and the specific plan project that would be developed under the initiative in terms of physical elements, fees, mitigation measures, conditions of approval, and, of course, the town's land use planning procedures. So this slide here is simply intended to show the 2013 project and the specific plan project side by side, and to illustrate an important point, which I'll talk about in the next slide, which is that from a physical perspective, the two projects are very, very similar, and I'll cover some exceptions to that point in the next slide. So these next three slides are adapted from Table 1 in the report. They're a very summarized version of that big, long table in the report, and they encompass many of the questions that the council raised on February 3rd. And so the first of the three slides, compares some of the physical characteristics of the 2013 project and the project that could be developed under the specific plan. So as you can see, the basic physical elements of site development, for instance, the total amount of office and research and development uses, the permitted uses, the maximum number of buildings and their heights, and lot coverage are pretty much identical between the 2013 project and the specific plan project. Key differences are that the specific plan project would include elevated walkways between buildings that could be used only as connectors and not for occupied office space. The actual square footage of those elevated walkways is not identified in the specific plan. The project sponsor provided some information through the town manager indicating that the total square footage of those elevated walkways would be something like 2,900 square feet. Also, slightly more parking spaces, something like 11 more parking spaces, would be developed under the specific plan compared to the 2013 project. And then lastly, the language on signage under the initiative and in the specific plan is slightly less protective. The 2013 project prohibits signage from being visible from the freeway, which would encompass both SRs 85 and 17. The specific plan just requires that signage not be visible from SR 85. This slide compares the fees that would be paid as part of the two projects. In every case, from the traffic impact mitigation fee to the contribution to the Larkin University traffic signal to school impact fees and the voluntary community benefit payment, all the fees would be the same between the two projects. I should also note that school fees could increase if elevated walkways are built on the project site by maybe a couple of $1,000s, depending on the actual square footage of those elevated walkways. So in this slide, we compare the more procedural aspects of the two projects. One major point I want to make is that both projects will be subject to town ordinances, like the tree ordinance, except those provisions of the zoning ordinance that would conflict with the specific plan, and these are laid out very explicitly in the specific plan itself. In addition, minor differences are items requiring interpretation between the approved project and the development plans, such as the substitution of plant species or defining what office uses are, could be approved or made by town staff under the 2013 project or the specific plan. And then furthermore, actual project implementation, such as the monitoring of conditions of approval and the review and issuance of building permits, would be made by town staff under both development scenarios, the specific plan and the 2013 project. So we start seeing procedural differences between the projects when changes are made to the approved projects that are more substantial than the ones I just mentioned. For instance, wholesale changes to the specific plan can be made only by voters for the next 7 years, while the town council could make changes to the 2013 project right from the time of approval. Similarly, major changes to the specific plan, I'm talking about things like the addition of residential uses or public retail uses to the project site, could be made only by voters for the next 7 years. Significant changes to the specific plan, such as increases in building height or the reduction of open space, could only be made by the Planning Commission, and this decision would be appealable to the town council. And so the last point I want to make is that the initiative, just like all ballot measures approved by voters, would not be subject to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and this is a function of state law and is not unique to this initiative. And I also want to make the point that as part of our work on comparing the project, we went through each of the conditions of approval required of the 2013 project, including all of the mitigation measures identified in the EIR prepared for that project, and we found that all of those conditions of approval, all of those mitigation measures have been included in the specific plan. That's our presentation. I'm happy to take questions. I think town staff is available for questions as well.
Mr. Mayor, staff was recommending that before we go to the attorney's presentation on the settlement and ballot measure, and then following up on the ballot arguments and recommendations, we offer the council any questions you may have of the report you directed.
Thank you. Does any member of council have questions? Seeing none, please continue.
Mr. Attorney?
Good evening again, Council and Mayor. At your last council meeting, if you recall, the petitioner stood up and made an offer of settlement in this case, and they also made that offer at a planning commission meeting earlier than that. And since that time, I undertook, at your direction, at that meeting, to engage in settlement negotiations with both the petitioners and the developer on this project, and we've reached a proposed settlement agreement that would end all the litigation. The terms of that settlement agreement provides the objectives that petitioner mentioned at the city council meeting, and it also meets the objectives of the town in that it restores the town council's approval for this project. Specifically, some of the terms are: it requires the Albright project to be in substantial conformance with the town council's approvals. It requires that the pedestrian bridges that were mentioned as what's different in the specific plan and what's different in your town approvals, it will now require those elevated pedestrian bridges to go through the A&S process and also pay the applicable community benefit fee. The settlement agreement requires the payment of attorney's fees for the petitioners, and it also requires that the Albright developers pay for the election costs up to $80,000. The settlement agreement also requires an additional $350,000 for nearby enhancement projects for the project. This is in addition to the $485,000 that was already approved in your conditions for your PD. and is also in the specific plan. So this is an additional $350,000. That money is also being used for compensation for the dedication and release of the right-of-way easements. It also requires, the differences that were mentioned, it also requires that the Community Development Director shall have the exact same authority on this project as she uses for any other projects in determining whether there's substantial compliance in her ability to move that item to either the Community Development Committee or the Planning Commission if she needs authority to look at that item. It also requires a dismissal of all the lawsuits, so we'll finally be done with all the lawsuits in regards to this matter. It does require that the town not take a formal action with regards to opposing the initiative. And it also, but that same clause, although the town can't take a position, individual council members can take a position as to the initiative. And finally, though, it also requires that the town not put a counter ballot measure or a proposed town measure on this ballot. So those are the major terms. After it was signed by both the developer and by the petitioners, there were some issues that came over the weekend, and that was one of the desk items that came out. We did clarify the points that needed to be made, that the town or the petitioners at any time after this initiative can propose an amendment to the specific plan if it was to pass. It also clarified that $350,000 is in addition to the $450,000, and then it included an or in the first page that was just a typo that was left out in between individuals and entity. It's my recommendation that you accept the settlement agreement and approve it. If the council doesn't accept the settlement agreement, then the next thing you would need to discuss is whether you want to put on a town-sponsored measure on the ballot. As mentioned, the ad hoc committee has met twice and discussed what type of initiative we would put on or what measure we would put on the ballot. And we discussed really trying to restore the town council's approval. And again, based on the 9212 report, there were 4 major issues that we saw differently, and that was, again, the elevated bridges. 2 was the signage issue. 3 was that administrative process, and the 4th was the cap on the community benefit fees. All 4 of those, I've given you red line versions, and the specific plan is exactly where they are and what would be taken out, so that's open for discussion on whether you want to do that. I would say all of those same issues that we'd try to accomplish through a proposed ballot measure are exactly what we've accomplished in the settlement agreement. Again, it will require that the approval of the elevated walkways and bridges go through the A&S process. What I didn't mention is in the settlement agreement, it actually states that there will be no signage visible from 17 and from 85. It reconfirms that the Community Development Director will handle this project exactly how she handles all other projects. And it also does remove that cap on the community benefit fees, and they will have to pay, if it goes to the A&S project, the elevators, they would have to pay that additional community benefit fee. So that concludes my report, and I'm open for any questions.
Questions of staff? Wow, no questions so far.
Well, and we're almost done with the staff presentation. Like the town-initiated ballot measure, the other question the council continued to tonight was the discussion of ballot arguments for or against any ballot measure, as well as positions on ballot measures. The schedule provided by the Registrar of Voters is again posted on the screen as it was provided a month ago. And as the council may recall, you can, as you did in 2007, authorize an argument submission, and then those members who agree can sign it. And separately, the council can take a position on any ballot measure in support or opposition. However, the settlement, as outlined by the town attorney, would preclude collective town action in opposition to the ballot measure. So that would include the town officially by majority vote taking a position against the ballot measure or authorizing a member to submit a town ballot argument against it. The recommendations before you from staff would be, and the town attorney would be, to accept the 9212 report as presented, to adopt the resolution calling the special election, which includes the direction for the town attorney to prepare and provide an impartial analysis, and to approve the settlement agreement that's been presented to you. Alternatives for the council would be to reject the proposed settlement agreement and then move to the optional recommendations provided in the staff report. Number 4 would be to direct preparation of a town ballot measure based on the work of the ad hoc committee as presented, and then to consider authorizing or providing ballot arguments or taking a town position. Your staff would recommend, if you wish to pursue the alternatives, you call a special meeting to consider same on Wednesday, March 5th, which is just before the deadline of submission to the county. That concludes staff report.
Thank you. Council have questions for staff? Seeing none, I'd like to invite the public to fill out a speaker card if you would like to speak on this topic. So far, we have 2 cards. One is Jeff Lockridge. Please come forward.
My name is Jeff Lockridge, 109 Paseo Laura. First of all, I'd like to thank all those who participated in this agreement, and I'm very proud of the way the town staff and council came together in such a short time frame and represented the town residents in this important decision. I also want to urge council to vote to accept this agreement tonight. It seems a very good compromise for the town, especially with the substantial administrative differences between the approved town PD and the upcoming ballot initiative. According to the 9212 report, while the project remains fairly consistent between the initiative version and the town's approved project, the administrative process would have changed dramatically. This agreement seems to circumvent those differences and bring the administrative process more in line with the existing town processes. The possible proposed elevated walkways are another very significant difference between the 2 plans. It might be a nice compromise for the developer in return for getting an approval on the walkways to request a modification of the ANS approval to incorporate changes to the parking plan. These could include eliminating parking spaces from the existing plan, suggestions and comments made by the public back in June. This would bring the number of parking spaces more in line with the 485,000 square foot project. Right now, the number of parking spaces is more in line with the 515,000 square foot project. Even with the reduction in parking spaces, this would still provide sufficient parking for the anticipated employees, even before the consideration of the potential transportation demand management program or the Vasona Light Rail extension, should that ever become a reality. It would also introduce valuable landscape buffers adjacent to both Charter Oaks and the Los Gatos Creek Trail. If this agreement is approved tonight, it would lay the groundwork for a better, more cooperative relationship between the town and the developer. That cooperation would result in a much more efficient project for both the developer and the town residents. That would be a good thing. If this agreement is not approved tonight, then I would hope that the town council put forth their own initiative for the ballot in June. But in closing, I would like to ask the council to approve this settlement agreement before you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Cecil Annison.
Good evening. My name is Cecil Annison, 208 Willow Hill Court, Los Gatos. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, and Council. I want to commend the town staff, the town council, the town attorney, and the other parties involved for diligently working towards agreement in the Albright settlement. I urge you to approve the settlement. To me, it's a win for all parties, especially changing the procedural processes to the 2013 approval. Again, thank you for all your hard work. I know it's been a lot.
Thank you. Looks like we have one more card coming. If there are any others, please present them to the clerk. Mr. Andy Wu.
second, please. Ready? Good evening, Mayor Leonardis, Vice Mayor Jensen, members of the Town Council. I see that on agenda item 5C of this evening's proceedings, it says, approve settlement agreement between Los Gatos Citizens for Responsible Development, Albright Way Initiative project sponsors, and the Town of Los Gatos, if one is presented. Well, up to about 3 p.m. this afternoon, I didn't know if one was going to be presented. So I kind of know how General Dwight Eisenhower felt having 2 speeches in his pocket. I mean, was he going to proclaim success on D-Day, or was he going to say, I just sent 250,000 men to their deaths? I'm glad I got to pull the one that said, we've reached successful conclusion. I know I'm a little bit premature, but since the settlement in this matter achieves all of the town's objectives, it achieves the objectives that my co-petitioner John Shepardson and I have sought from the very beginning, I can say with some assurance that we've come to a meaningful and good resolution. Now, following on the heels of the Academy Awards, here's my thank you speech. I'd like to thank our attorney, Rozoya, who couldn't be here tonight, for her hard work, her unbiased legal analysis, and sticking out with us to see this thing through. I'd like to thank our town attorney, Rob Schultz, who kept us on track and on task and being available during the weekend. Just an aside, I think you should give Mr. Schultz some paid time off. I see his eyes are very tired. He's wearing glasses today, just like I am. I'd like to thank the developer's attorney, George Milston, who was above board and dealt with this matter in a fair and even-handed manner. And of course, I'd like to thank the members of the Town Council above all for uniting with the citizens of this town of ours and in assisting us in reaching a beneficial settlement for all Los Gatans. I would hope, and I don't know if young Mr. Phil Albanese is in the audience tonight, but I would hope that with all of the millions of dollars his family is going to make off the concrete business on this project, that they'd consider an endowment to the Markula Center for Social Justice. Miss Leslie Logan's organization, I would hope that they would advocate for a wise and thoughtful use of all the monies that are going to be coming to the school district, especially to add new classrooms to offset the growth in student population of, I heard somewhere around 500 within the next year or so from all of the recent residential developments, Bluebird Lane, Laurel Muse. And of course, I thank the town and hope they'll fulfill its obligations.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. Thank you. That is our last speaker card. Seeing no others coming forward, I'm going to close the public hearing on this and look to council for discussion and a motion. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll start out with the easy one. I'm going to move to accept the 9212 report, and in making that motion, I want to commend the individuals who prepared that report. As one of the council people who have lived with this application for many years and have had to burrow down in it in great detail, I was really impressed that somebody could come forward in 2 weeks, understand the initiative, understand the plan development, and do a very clear-cut and, I felt, objective report. So my motion is to accept that report.
I'll second that motion, and I will also second what the maker of the motion said. I think it was an astounding job by your organization in very short order, but very thoroughgoing, and the clarity was such that it made this motion an easy motion for us to accommodate. Vice Mayor, did you have a comment? I saw your hand going up.
No, I was just going to offer a second, but that's been done.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Further discussion. I'll call the question. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Passes unanimously. Further discussion. Or
okay.
Further motions. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to move to adopt the resolution calling for a special election and its associated, the associated part of that motion that requests our town attorney to prepare, and you have to give me the words, unbiased description, impartial.
We have a motion, Vice Mayor.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion. Councilmember Spector.
Yes, the one thing I just wanted, this is probably my only negative thing tonight. The council has agreed not to, as a body, not to take any position on the initiative. I do understand that the developers are holding the option of doing a public support PR for the initiative, and since I think that creates negativity, I'm hoping that we can pull back on that so we can go forward in this community in the sense that we have right now this evening.
Vice Mayor.
As the seconder, I'll echo those comments. I would hope that we don't have a campaign, and because the comments by Councilwoman Spector indicated that at least someone thinks that we're going to approve the settlement. One of the reasons that I am supporting calling the special election is that the settlement agreement causes the developer to pay the town up to $80,000 for election costs, and I think that's only fair.
Further discussion. We have a motion and a second. I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None. Passes unanimously. More discussion or another motion. Councilmember Brzezinski.
I'll move to approve the settlement agreement between the Los Gatos Citizens for Responsible Development, Albright Way Initiative project sponsors, and the town of Los Gatos.
Vice Mayor.
I'll second the motion, and in doing so, just indicate my thanks to council, to Mr. Schultz in particular, to staff, to the petitioners, Mr. Wu, Mr. Shepherdson, all of you who participated in being willing to come to the table and come to an agreement. And I hope very much that by reaching a settlement that we can move forward in a positive manner. The reason that I would support the settlement agreement and in particular, and second the motion, is number one, it does essentially revert to the council-approved project. It actually provides the town with an additional $350,000 that we didn't have out of the approved project. It actually does, with respect to the sky bridges, what would have happened under the council-approved project, which is to have the developer come back through our normal process with that proposal, which they would have had to do under the council-proposed project. It settles the litigation. It gives us $80,000 to pay for the election, which unfortunately we still have to do. And it does provide council still with the opportunity to individually comment on the initiative if they believe that that's appropriate. Or urge perhaps that those sponsoring the initiative accept the settlement in a more complete manner by not campaigning for it.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to be supporting the motion, but I want to put this in a little bit of personal context. Last June, I was the one who made the motion that to approve the planned development of this property. Ultimately, my motion got a unanimous acceptance by this council, but I can tell you that every single person up here disagreed with some aspect of my motion, but nevertheless decided that, all told, it was better to go forward with it. I was very disappointed after we had a unanimous acceptance of that planned development to have the lawsuits and to have the initiative. I found that disappointing in its attack on the planned development and also on the ambiance that it created within our town. However, within the past 2 weeks, what's happened is that the interest reflected in the initiative versus the interest reflected in the lawsuits versus the interest reflected in the potential for a initiative put on the ballot by the town created competing interest, which motivated people to reach a settlement. And I too want to commend everybody, and I pretty much see you all in this room, everybody who worked on to getting this to a successful conclusion. Thank you.
Councilmember Brzezinski.
As the maker of the motion, I want to second everything that I've heard from my fellow council persons in relationship to this motion. And I also want to kind of reflect on how successful all parties successfully worked to come to this point in time. I think over the last several weeks we've had a community that's been confused about what we were attempting to do, confused about what decisions we had made, and probably at a stalemate. And I think that what we've seen in the last few weeks, by all parties sitting together to dialogue, not necessarily in the same room, but to dialogue regarding these issues, and to come from some pretty distant positions to a closure in a very short period of time is extremely commendable. It speaks very well for our community. It speaks very well for the engagement of all members who are involved here in our community. And I want to particularly thank its staff, as has been said, particularly our new attorney, Rob Schultz. We did this deliberately so that he would have trial by fire when he took the seat, and he's done an extraordinary job. And I think that for me and for the rest of the council, I'm sure, we're looking forward now to moving ahead and to put this part of our current dialogue behind us, but to also remind ourselves that in government it is possible to compromise. In government it is possible actually to achieve some successful conclusion that allows everybody to be successful. And we don't see that too many times, I think, in other governments beyond this House. And I just feel very proud that we're coming to this point in our discussion as a community.
Further comments? Nothing else? Well, I'll weigh in on this. Again, I want to thank the community for putting aside the differences and working together and coming up with a solution, echoing what Councilmember Brzezinski said. It's very commendable, and it speaks highly of the kind of community we live in when we can do that. I also want to commend staff for their hard work on this, and I also am looking forward to this project moving forward and hopefully Netflix occupying these buildings, because we appreciate them, and I'm sure no one will disagree with that. I'm hoping, as the Vice Mayor mentioned, that if there is some sort of a campaign, that perhaps it will be better, the money could be better spent going towards schools, if that's a choice that could be made by the developer, as opposed to sending out pretty glossy mailers. But that's your money and your choice. But that's one guy's opinion. And with those few comments, I guess it'll be time to call the question here. All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. Thank you. This meeting is now adjourned.